Get ready because what just happened in the White House press room is the kind of political showdown that doesn't just disappear. It gets talked about for years. Karoline Leavitt didn't just win a debate in the White House press briefing room, she completely dismantled CNN's Kaitlan Collins live, unfiltered and in front of the entire nation. It was supposed to be a standard press conference, nothing out of the ordinary. A few pointed questions from journalists, some rehearsed responses from the administration, and a predictable spin cycle that would follow on cable news. That was the plan. But what actually happened was something no one saw coming, least of all Kaitlan Collins. CNN has spent years crafting narratives, controlling what the public sees and hears, and using their network to push an agenda. However, live television has a funny way of exposing the truth, and this time they couldn't edit their way out of what was about to unfold. The cameras were rolling, the press room was full, and Kaitlan Collins had convinced herself that this would be her moment. She was ready to deliver the ultimate gotcha question, the one that would leave Karoline stammering, searching for words, and backed into a corner. She took her shot on the freeze in federal funding. Who advised the president on the legality of telling government agencies that they don't have to spend money already appropriated by Congress? It was a question designed to trip Karoline up, to make the administration look reckless, as if they were playing fast and loose with the law. Caitlin's tone carried a smug confidence, expecting to see hesitation, or maybe even a slip-up that she and CNN could run with for days. But Karoline didn't hesitate. Well, as the OM memo states, this is certainly within the confines of the law, she said, cool and composed. So the White House counsel's office believes that this is within the president's power to do, and therefore he's doing it. No stumble, no uncertainty, just facts. Kaitlan tried again, this time with more insistence, as if repeating the question would somehow unravel Karoline's composure. So they disagree with lawmakers who say that they don't have the power to freeze this funding? Karoline's response was swift and unwavering. Again, I would point you to the language in the memo that clearly states this is within the law. Boom! Another direct hit. Kaitlan was trying to poke holes in something that had already been legally justified. The press room was quiet now, the energy shifting as reporters sensed what was happening. But Kaitlan wasn't done. If she couldn't land a blow on the funding freeze, maybe she could pivot to something even more controversial. She straightened in her chair, her voice laced with the usual righteous indignation CNN loves to weaponize. And on what happened on Friday night, the administration fired several inspectors general without giving Congress the 30-day legally required notification that they were being fired. I think only 2 were left at DHS and the DOJ. And then yesterday we saw several prosecutors, I believe 12, fired from the Justice Department who worked on the investigations into the president. As you know, they are career prosecutors, therefore they are afforded civil service protections. How is the administration deciding which laws to follow and which ones to ignore? This was it. The question Kaitlan had been waiting to drop. The one she thought would corner Karoline into either admitting wrongdoing or struggling to justify the administration's actions. Either way, CNN would get their soundbite. But what Kaitlan didn't expect was for Karoline to fire back with something that couldn't be spun, something rooted in both legal precedent and undeniable logic. So, it is the belief of this White House and the White House counsel's office that the president was within his executive authority to do that, Karoline said, completely unfazed. He is the executive of the executive branch, and therefore he has the power to fire anyone within the executive branch that he wishes to. Kaitlan blinked. That wasn't the answer she had wanted. And if you're questioning the legality, I'd suggest looking at the Supreme Court case Scalia Law LLC versus the Customs Bureau Protection, which directly affirms this authority, Karoline added, landing another unshakable fact right in front of the entire press pool. Silence. A slight shift in Kaitlan's expression, the realization creeping in that this wasn't going the way she had planned. Are you confident that if they bring lawsuits against you, the prosecutors who were fired, that they will succeed? Kaitlan asked, her tone losing its initial sharpness. Karoline didn't even hesitate. We will win in court, yes. And just like that, Kaitlan Collins had lost. There was no spin CNN could put on this to make it look good. No selective editing that would change the outcome. The reality was laid bare for everyone watching. Karoline Leavitt had completely outclassed Kaitlan in every way on live television, and the internet noticed almost immediately. Clips of the exchange flooded social media. Twitter lit up with reactions. Hashtags like CN Exposed and fake news trended within minutes. Conservatives hailed the moment as a takedown of epic proportions. Even some moderate voices admitted that Collins had walked into a battle she wasn't prepared to fight. CNN was in full-blown panic mode. They knew this looked bad. Really bad. They scrambled to contain the damage, pushing out their own heavily edited versions of the exchange, trying to control the narrative before it spiraled further. But it was too late. The full unedited version was already circulating, spreading across platforms like wildfire. The reaction wasn't just limited to Twitter. YouTube channels were analyzing the moment frame by frame. TikTok was flooded with breakdowns of Kaitlan's visible discomfort, and conservative media was amplifying Karoline's words to an even larger audience. This was supposed to be Kaitlan's big moment. Instead, it became the moment Karoline Leavitt cemented her reputation as an unshakable force in the political arena. CNN wanted this clip buried, erased, forgotten. But the problem with the internet is that once something is out there, it's out there forever. Kaitlan Collins had walked into the press room thinking she was about to score a knockout against Karoline Leavitt. Instead, she was the one left scrambling, caught completely off guard, exposed for what she truly was. Another mainstream media pawn trying and failing to control the narrative. But this wasn't even the worst part. As bad as it already looked for CNN, things were about to get even worse. This was just the beginning. The next question Kaitlan asked would push Karoline to unleash the most devastating response yet, one that wouldn't just destroy Kaitlan in the moment but would shake CNN's credibility to its core. When you hear what happened next, you'll understand why the network was absolutely desperate to make sure you never saw it. Kaitlan Collins had already lost control of the conversation, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. The White House press room was dead silent. The energy had shifted, and every journalist in the room knew what was happening. Karoline Leavitt had just flipped the script. Instead of backing down, Kaitlan decided to go for one last desperate pivot. If she couldn't rattle Karoline on legal grounds, maybe she could shift the narrative to something every American was feeling: economic pain. She straightened up, adjusted her expression, and fired off the next question, this time with a sharper edge. There is a lot of reporting out there that is putting the blame on this White House for the increased cost of eggs. Inflation is already hitting Americans hard, and now we're seeing even more price spikes on essential goods. Can you explain why this administration's policies are making it harder for American families to afford something as basic as eggs? A textbook CNN move. Take a problem that had been brewing for years under the previous administration, conveniently ignore the root causes, and pin it all on the current leadership. The strategy was obvious. Get Karoline to fumble, get her to take the bait, force her into a defensive position. The problem? Karoline wasn't falling for it. Without missing a beat, she met Kaitlan's stare and delivered a response that would send shockwaves through the press room and beyond. I'd like to remind everyone here that in 2024, when Joe Biden was either in the Oval Office or, quite frankly, asleep upstairs in the residence, I'm not really sure, egg prices increased by 65% across this country. A slight murmur rippled through the room. Some reporters shifted in their seats. Others looked down at their notes as if suddenly realizing they were about to witness something bigger than they had anticipated. Karoline continued, unwavering. And it wasn't just eggs. The cost of groceries, gasoline, rent, and just about everything else skyrocketed under the Biden administration. And let's be very clear, these price hikes weren't accidental. They were the direct result of reckless economic policies, endless government spending, and an administration that was more focused on climate regulations and virtue signaling than making life affordable for American families. Kaitlan Collins blinked, but she wasn't giving up. But isn't it true that prices continue to rise under this administration? What do you say to Americans who are still struggling? Karoline smiled slightly as if she had been expecting this exact question. I'd say, let's talk about the real reason behind the egg shortage. Let's talk about why prices aren't just high, but why we're actually seeing supply chain breakdowns across the board. And let's talk about something CNN conveniently won't report on. The room was completely still. No one dared to interrupt. The Biden administration's Department of Agriculture ordered the mass killing of over 100 million chickens, which directly contributed to a nationwide shortage of eggs. That's not speculation. That's not political spin. That's just a fact. You cut down the supply, prices go up. It's basic economics. And yet somehow we're supposed to pretend that this was unavoidable, that it just happened by accident. No, this was a direct policy decision made by the previous administration. Another wave of murmurs spread through the press pool. Some journalists looked at each other as if trying to gauge whether they should ask a follow-up question or just stay quiet and let this moment unfold. Karoline wasn't done. And let's go even further. Why do Americans continue to struggle? Why are basic goods still too expensive? Because the damage was already done. Inflation doesn't just go away overnight. You don't print trillions of dollars, shut down American energy production, and drive businesses into the ground for 4 straight years and then expect things to magically fix themselves the moment a new president takes office. That's not how economies work. That's not how reality works. Kaitlan shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be the one pressing Karoline for answers. But now Karoline was taking full control of the exchange, exposing not just the failures of the previous administration, but the very media narratives that had enabled those failures to go unchecked. And let's talk about what this administration is actually doing to reverse the damage. The president has already taken steps to ease the burden on American families. He has pushed for energy independence, cut unnecessary regulations that strangled small businesses, and nominated leaders like Brooke Rollins to take over key positions, people who actually understand how to fix the mess we inherited. And yet, what does CNN do? They don't cover the solutions. They don't cover the recovery. They just try to manufacture outrage over problems they helped create in the first place. Kaitlan tried to interject, but Karoline wasn't having it. No, I'm not finished, because the American people deserve to hear the truth about why things got this bad to begin with. At this point, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Even some of the most seasoned reporters looked hesitant to ask their own questions, as if they weren't sure if they wanted to become the next target of Karoline's unshakable rebuttal. But the real story wasn't just happening inside the press room, it was happening online. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were flooding social media. Twitter exploded with reactions. Hashtags like OneEggGate, CMN Exposed, and Fake News Meltdown were trending in real time. The conservative media sphere was celebrating Karoline's unfiltered takedown of Kaitlan Collins, while even some mainstream viewers admitted this wasn't a good look for CNN. But the biggest problem for CNN? The unedited footage was out. They couldn't spin it. They couldn't selectively edit their way out of this one. The full exchange was already making the rounds on YouTube, TikTok, and every major social platform, and the response was overwhelming. Conservative voices pointed out how Kaitlan had walked straight into this debate thinking she would control the narrative, only to be publicly humiliated. Moderates admitted that Karoline had come armed with facts that were impossible to ignore. Even left-leaning commentators were struggling to defend CNN's performance, instead shifting their focus to damage control. That was the real problem for CNN. They had lost control. This wasn't just about one bad exchange in a press room. This was about trust, about credibility, about the growing realization among Americans that the mainstream media was no longer the gatekeeper of truth. Karoline Leavitt had done more than just embarrass Kaitlan Collins. She had exposed the entire game. For CNN, the worst was yet to come because, while they were scrambling to minimize the damage, Karoline was about to take things to an entirely new level. The next question Kaitlan asked wouldn't just backfire, it would ignite a firestorm. And the fallout would be something CNN never saw coming. Kaitlan Collins had already lost control of the narrative, but she was too deep into this mess to back out now. She had tried to corner Karoline Leavitt with legal questions, but Karoline shut her down. Kaitlan had attempted to shift the focus to economic struggles, only for Karoline to expose the real reasons behind the crisis. At this point, Kaitlan had no choice but to go all in. She had to regain some level of control, no matter what it took. The problem? Karoline saw it coming from a mile away. Kaitlan took a deep breath, glanced at her notes, and went for the kill shot. Last night, President Trump made some highly controversial comments regarding political persecution and the weaponization of the justice system. Critics argue that he is undermining the legitimacy of the judiciary by attacking investigations into his own administration. How does the White House respond to accusations that President Trump is using his power to retaliate against those who have scrutinized him? There it was, the setup, the trap, the moment CNN had been waiting for. If Karoline hesitated, fumbled, or even slightly misspoke, this would be the headline across every major outlet by the end of the day. White House justifies political retaliation. They wanted her to stumble. They wanted her to struggle. They wanted her to show weakness. But instead, Karoline did what she does best. She fired back without missing a beat. She leaned slightly forward, her voice steady and unwavering. Let's talk about political retaliation. Let's talk about the actual weaponization of the justice system, because if you want to have this conversation, we're going to have it the right way, with facts. The room was silent. The energy had shifted again. The reporters weren't just watching this unfold, they were bracing for impact. For years, Karoline continued, Democrats and the media have painted President Trump as a threat to democracy, as a criminal, as someone who needs to be taken down at all costs. And what did they do? They launched investigation after investigation, not because of actual crimes, but because they wanted to use the legal system as a political weapon. They spent years pushing the Russia hoax, impeached him twice over baseless charges, and when none of that worked, they moved on to something even more extreme. She let that sit for a moment, making sure every person in the room was absorbing the weight of what she was saying. The Biden Justice Department, under the direction of Democrat leadership, actively targeted President Trump with politically motivated prosecutions. He was dragged into courtrooms for weeks at a time. The sitting administration did everything in its power to keep him tied up in legal battles while he was running for office. And what was the goal? It wasn't about justice. It was about stopping him, about preventing him from winning. A few journalists in the room shifted uncomfortably. Kaitlan pursed her lips but said nothing. And let's be very clear about what that rhetoric has led to, Karoline continued. We have now seen 2 assassination attempts on President Trump. 2. And what do both of those attackers have in common? They were radicalized by the exact same talking points that outlets like CNN push every single day. When you call a sitting president a threat to democracy, when you compare him to some of history's worst dictators, when you tell people that the only way to save the country is to stop him, there are lunatics out there who will take that literally. And we've seen exactly what that leads to. The tension in the room was suffocating. No one wanted to be the one to challenge her directly. So let me ask you this, Kaitlan, Karoline said, her tone calm but pointed. If President Trump is supposedly the one engaging in political retaliation, where was CNN's outrage when Joe Biden publicly said he wanted to make sure Trump never holds power again? Where was the media's concern when Kamala Harris and Chuck Schumer openly celebrated the legal cases against him? You want to talk about the legitimacy of the judiciary? Where were the questions when Democrat-backed prosecutors ran campaign ads bragging about indicting Trump? Or when leftist donors poured millions into electing district attorneys whose only mission was to go after one man? Kaitlan's eyes darted back to her notes, searching for something, anything, to push back with. But there was nothing. You want to talk about political persecution? Karoline continued. How about the fact that Trump sat in a courtroom for 7 weeks while his opponent was out campaigning? How about the fact that the same people who claim to care about democracy were actively trying to remove the leading Republican candidate from the ballot? That's not democracy. That's authoritarianism. For the first time since this press conference began, Kaitlan Collins looked completely out of her depth. Karoline took a breath, then delivered the final blow. The reality is this. President Trump isn't weaponizing the justice system. He's fighting back against a justice system that was already weaponized against him. And the American people see it for exactly what it is. The room was silent. Dead silent. But outside the press room, the internet was anything but quiet. The moment the clip hit social media, it went viral at a speed CNN never saw coming. The hashtags CNN exposed and political persecution trended within minutes. Viewers weren't just talking about how Karoline destroyed Kaitlan Collins. They were pointing out the hypocrisy of the media's entire narrative. Even left-leaning commentators were struggling to spin it. Some tried to frame it as aggressive rhetoric, but the facts were too clear, too undeniable. The clips were everywhere. TikTok, YouTube, Twitter. No matter where you looked, Karoline's takedown was front and center. For CNN, this was a nightmare scenario. This wasn't just a bad segment or a tough interview. This was a full-scale exposure of their bias, their selective outrage, and their willingness to ignore political persecution when it suited their narrative. Kaitlan Collins had walked into the White House press briefing room thinking she was about to land a knockout punch on the administration. Instead, she had just handed Karoline Leavitt one of the biggest viral moments of the year. And the worst part for CNN? It wasn't over yet, because Karoline wasn't just exposing political persecution. She was about to turn the spotlight on the media itself. The next thing she said wouldn't just dismantle Kaitlan Collins. It would dismantle CNN. Karoline Leavitt had already dismantled Kaitlan Collins, exposed the media's hypocrisy, and laid bare the political persecution that CNN and its allies had spent years ignoring. But she wasn't done, not even close. Now she was about to hit them where it hurt the most. She was about to expose the media itself, not just CNN, not just Kaitlan Collins, but the entire corrupt corporate machine that had spent decades manipulating public opinion, covering for Democrats, and silencing voices they couldn't control. And it all started with one simple, brutal truth. "The American people don't trust you anymore," Karoline said, her voice steady and unwavering. And let's be honest, you've earned that distrust. Kaitlan's expression tightened, but she didn't interrupt. She couldn't. For years, outlets like CNN have positioned themselves as neutral arbiters of truth. You tell the public that you're just reporting the facts, that you're holding power accountable, but in reality, you are the mouthpiece of one political party. You don't investigate both sides. You don't ask tough questions when a Democrat is in power. You run cover. You protect them. And when someone like President Trump comes along, someone you can't control, you do everything in your power to destroy them. She let that sink in for a moment, giving the room a chance to absorb what she had just said. And that's why we're here right now, isn't it? That's why CNN is desperate to spin this press briefing into some kind of scandal. Because the moment the American people wake up to the fact that you are not journalists, that you are activists, that you are operating as an extension of the Democratic Party, that's the moment you lose all of your power. Kaitlan shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and a few reporters in the room looked down at their notes, suddenly unwilling to make eye contact. Think about what CNN has done over the past decade, Karoline continued. Relentlessly, you pushed the Russia hoax for years despite knowing it was a lie. You amplified a fake dossier. You told Americans that their duly elected president was a Russian asset, all while ignoring the fact that it was Hillary Clinton's team that paid for the entire fabrication. Did anyone at CNN apologize for that? Did anyone at CNN lose their job? No, because it was never about the truth. It was about politics. She wasn't just addressing Kaitlan Collins anymore. She was addressing the entire industry. And then you moved on to impeachment, twice. You took a phone call, twisted it into a crime, and spent months pretending that it was a scandal. Meanwhile, actual corruption, like the money that flowed into the Biden family through foreign business deals, was ignored conveniently. And why? Because it wasn't about holding power accountable, it was about targeting one man. Karoline could see it in Kaitlan's face. She was trapped. There was no escape from this. She could try to push back, but what could she say? The receipts were too clear, too undeniable. And then let's talk about 2020, Karoline continued. The way you covered the election, the way you dismissed Hunter Biden's laptop as Russian disinformation even though you knew it wasn't. The way you refused to cover real concerns about election integrity while simultaneously calling anyone who questioned it a threat to democracy. You didn't ask questions, you shut down conversations. You labeled conservatives as extremists. You pushed censorship. You colluded with big tech to control what Americans could and couldn't see. And now you sit here and act like you have the moral authority to lecture us about attacks on democracy? Give me a break. The room was silent. It wasn't just Kaitlan who had been caught in the crossfire. Every journalist in that press room was suddenly feeling the weight of what was happening. Let's go even further, Karoline added. What about the COVID cover-up? You spent years demonizing anyone who questioned the government's response. You silenced doctors. You mocked people who brought up concerns about vaccine mandates. You deplatformed anyone who didn't toe the party line. And yet, years later, the things you called conspiracy theories turned out to be true. Natural immunity was real. lockdowns did cause massive economic and social damage. And Fauci? He wasn't a hero. He was a bureaucrat who misled the public at every turn. But did CNN ever hold him accountable? No, because you were too busy pushing propaganda. Karoline paused for a second, scanning the room. Not a single journalist spoke up. No one dared. And now, here we are again, she continued. Another election, another attempt to manipulate public opinion. CNN is here today not to ask real questions, not to seek the truth, but to manufacture a controversy. You want to paint President Trump as a dictator. You want to convince Americans that he's a threat to democracy. You want to push another hoax, another lie, another narrative that keeps your network relevant. Because deep down you know the truth. Your ratings are in free fall, your credibility is gone. The American people have stopped listening to you, and that scares you more than anything. Kaitlan Collins looked like she wanted to respond, but she had nothing. There was nothing she could say because everything Karoline had just said was the truth. And it wasn't just the people in that press room who realized it. The internet was already on fire. Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, every platform was exploding with clips of Karoline's brutal takedown. The hashtags CNN cover up, fake news meltdown, and exposed by Karoline were trending within minutes. Conservative commentators were breaking it down in real time, while even some left-leaning journalists admitted this was bad for CNN. Very bad. But the worst part for CNN was that they couldn't control it. They couldn't edit their way out of this one. The footage was already out. The unfiltered, uncut version was spreading faster than any narrative they could possibly push. And Karoline wasn't done yet. Because if CNN thought this was bad, they hadn't seen anything yet. She had one final truth bomb left to drop, one that would make it impossible for anyone to deny what was really happening. She was about to expose how the media's lies weren't just damaging public discourse, they were putting lives in danger. And when she was done, there would be no coming back from it. Karoline Leavitt had already done what no one else in that press room dared to do. She called out the media, exposed their lies, and laid bare their coordinated efforts to manipulate public perception. But she wasn't done yet. If CNN thought they could walk away from this without real consequences, they were dead wrong. Karoline was about to take this to a whole new level. She wasn't just going to call them out. She was going to expose the direct consequences of their lies. She was going to show in undeniable terms how their rhetoric wasn't just misleading people, it was putting lives in danger. She took a deep breath, looked straight at Kaitlan Collins, and dropped the final devastating truth bomb. You don't just push false narratives. You don't just spin the truth. Your network, CNN, has actively contributed to real-world violence, and I'm not going to let you sit here and pretend otherwise. Kaitlan stiffened. A few reporters in the room exchanged uneasy glances. They had no idea what was coming next, but they could feel it was about to get even worse. We all saw what happened on June 15th, Karoline continued. An armed man attempted to break into a Trump rally with a clear intention to do harm. Why? Because he had been radicalized by the exact kind of rhetoric that CNN pumps out every single day. The constant fear-mongering, the endless lies about how President Trump is a threat to democracy, the non-stop comparisons to authoritarian dictators. What do you think happens when unstable individuals believe those lies? They act on them. She let that statement hang in the air, giving it time to sink in. The room was completely still. And that wasn't the first time, she added. In 2020, a radicalized leftist targeted Republican lawmakers at a baseball field, killing Congressman Steve Scalise. Do you know what that attacker said? He believed Republicans were destroying the country. Why? Because he was fed that exact message by networks like yours. And what was CNN's response? Did anyone take responsibility? Did anyone acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, their rhetoric was fueling this kind of extremism? Of course not. Kaitlan swallowed hard but said nothing. And then, of course, we have the most recent attempt on President Trump's life, Karoline continued, her voice sharp. A radicalized individual convinced by years of media lies attempted to take him out. And yet CNN had the audacity to turn around and act like Trump somehow brought it on himself, as if he's the problem, as if the real threat isn't the endless, reckless, irresponsible fear-mongering that your network pumps into the public every single day. A few journalists in the back of the room shifted uncomfortably. They knew she was right. They knew that for all the times CNN had accused conservatives of spreading dangerous rhetoric, they had never once taken responsibility for the violence their own messaging had incited. "And don't even get me started on the riots," Karoline said, shaking her head. "For months in 2020, cities burned, businesses were destroyed, innocent people were attacked in the streets. And what did CNN do? You called them peaceful protests. You gaslit the American public. You excused the violence. You spent more time justifying the destruction than condemning it. But the moment conservatives push back, the moment people on the right decide they aren't going to sit quietly while their country is torn apart, suddenly it's extremism. Suddenly it's a threat to democracy. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was staggering. Let's make something very clear," Karoline continued. "President Trump is not the one dividing this country. He's not the one pushing people toward violence. Your network tells people every day that if they don't agree with you, they're dangerous, that if they support President Trump, they're a threat to democracy, that if they believe in secure borders, energy independence, or fair elections, they're somehow radicals. And then you sit here in this press room and pretend to be confused when people start taking that rhetoric seriously." Kaitlan's face was unreadable, but the damage was already done. Karoline had completely flipped the script. She had exposed in the clearest terms possible that the real threat to democracy wasn't President Trump, it was the mainstream media itself. "And let's talk about what you're trying to do now," Karoline added, her tone turning even sharper. "You're desperately trying to frame this election as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. You're trying to convince the American people that if they vote for Trump, they're voting to end the republic. But here's the truth. This election isn't about Trump versus democracy. It's about Trump versus a corrupt establishment that will do anything to hold on to power, even if it means lying to the American people every single day." There was no coming back from this for CNN. The entire room knew it, and the American people knew it too. Because as this moment unfolded, the internet was on fire. The clips were everywhere. Twitter was exploding with hashtags like media accountability, fake news exposed, and Karoline destroys CNN. Even mainstream outlets were struggling to keep up with the fallout. Conservative news sites were running headlines like "Karoline Leavitt exposes CNN's lies and brutal takedown," while left-leaning outlets were frantically trying to shift the conversation. But it was too late. This wasn't just another political debate. This wasn't just another press conference. This was a turning point, a moment when millions of Americans saw in real time exactly how dishonest, manipulative, and dangerous the mainstream media had become. Karoline Leavitt had just done what so many before her had tried and failed to do. She had exposed CNN in a way that no amount of damage control could fix. But the most devastating part was that she wasn't even finished yet. Because after all the lies, all the spin, all the manufactured outrage, there was still one final truth that needed to be said. The truth about why, despite everything the media had done, despite all the hoaxes, the smears, the relentless attacks, President Trump was more popular than ever. And once Karoline said it, there would be no denying it. CNN was already in full-blown meltdown mode, but after what Karoline was about to say next, they wouldn't just be panicking, they would be done. Karoline Leavitt had just delivered one of the most brutal takedowns in modern press briefing history. Kaitlan Collins was left speechless. The media, exposed and humiliated, had no defense. And yet, Karoline wasn't finished. While CNN was already in full-blown damage control mode, there was still one final truth that needed to be spoken. A truth that no mainstream outlet wanted to admit. A truth that, despite years of relentless attacks, hoaxes, and media manipulation, had become undeniable. President Donald J. Trump was more popular than ever. Karoline took a deep breath, looked straight into the cameras, and made sure that every American watching understood exactly why. "You want to know why President Trump is leading in the polls?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "It's not because of some media spin. It's not because of political tricks. It's because the American people have seen the truth with their own eyes." She glanced at Kaitlan Collins, whose face was frozen in a strained expression, as if she was still processing everything that had just happened. But Karoline wasn't waiting for a response. She was driving the final nail into the coffin. They watched as President Trump rebuilt this country only to see it torn apart the moment the Democrats took control. They remember the lowest unemployment rates in history, record-breaking job growth, and energy independence. They remember peace deals that no one thought were possible. They remember a secure border. They remember what it was like to walk into a grocery store and actually afford to feed their families. She let those words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. And now they see the exact opposite. They see chaos. They see weakness. They see a country in decline, and they know exactly who is responsible for it. A hush fell over the room. No one dared to challenge her because how could they? The evidence was everywhere. The media told them inflation wasn't real until their grocery bills doubled. The media told them the border was secure until their communities were overrun. The media told them crime wasn't increasing until their cities became war zones. The media told them Biden was the most competent in history until they saw him live on camera, unable to complete a sentence. Kaitlan Collins shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable, but Karoline wasn't letting up. The reason President Trump is more popular than ever is because the American people have lived the difference. They don't need CNN to tell them what to think. They don't need the New York Times to fact-check reality. They don't need Washington elites to explain what's happening right in front of them. They see it. They feel it. And that's why, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many hoaxes you push, no matter how many lies you tell, Donald Trump is winning. Twitter was already melting down. Clips of Karoline's response were spreading like wildfire. Hashtags like Trump surge, Karoline exposes CNN, and media meltdown were trending at record speed. The panic inside CNN's headquarters was palpable. They knew they had lost control again. But Karoline wasn't done yet. The media spent years telling Americans that President Trump was a threat to democracy, she said, her voice steady. But what's the real threat? A president who puts America first, or a media that lies, manipulates, and silences dissent to protect the political establishment? The silence in the room was deafening. And let's be honest, Karoline continued, CNN knows the answer to that question. That's why they cut Trump's speeches mid-broadcast. That's why they blacklist conservative voices. That's why they push censorship and work with big tech to silence opinions they don't like. Because they know that if Americans actually hear the truth, if they actually listen to President Trump, if they actually see the facts, then the media loses all power. A couple of reporters exchanged nervous glances. They knew she was right. That's why this press conference matters, Karoline said. That's why the truth matters, because for too long, Americans have been force-fed a false reality. But that ends today, because no matter how hard CNN and the rest of the media try to control the narrative, no matter how many times they try to bury the truth, Americans are waking up. Kaitlan Collins was silent. She had nothing left. No more loaded questions, no more smirking confidence, just quiet acknowledgement that she had walked into a fight she was never prepared to win. And then Karoline delivered the final blow. The reason CNN wanted to bury this clip, she asked, a knowing smile crossing her face, is because they knew exactly how it would end. With the truth exposed, with their lies shattered, and with the American people more awake than ever. The press room was still. The internet was exploding. CNN was spiraling. And Karoline, she had just sealed one of the most unforgettable press briefings in history. But the real story wasn't just what happened in that room. It was what was coming next. Because if this press briefing proved anything, it was that the media no longer controlled the narrative. The American people did, and in 2024, they were going to make sure their voices were heard loud and clear.